Some stories shake the ground beneath your feet, not because they're sensational, but because they seem too impossible to believe. This is one of those stories. A Hollywood legend, revered for his talent and fierce protection of his privacy, was found dead beside his beloved wife in their sacred home in Santa Fe. The scene was chilling. 2 lifeless bodies in separate rooms, and a third victim, one of their dogs, also dead. On February 26, 2025, the man was Gene Hackman, a 2-time Oscar winner, and the woman was Betsy Arakawa, a former classical pianist and businesswoman. Together, they had shared over 3 decades of life in silence, away from the glare of the cameras. But what if the most tragic part of the story wasn't the loss, but what happened afterward? What if in the days following their deaths, an even darker mystery emerged, one that threatened to redefine everything we thought we knew about the couple and their family in the days after the discovery? Before we begin the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on other fascinating stories. Leave your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what you think. Now, let's dive into the story. Law enforcement rushed to uncover what had happened behind the closed doors of the Hackman home. At first, it seemed like an unexpected tragedy. 2 elderly individuals dying at their home just days apart, but that story quickly crumbled. Not only because of the physical evidence found inside the house, but also because of what happened next. A series of court records, emergency motions, and ultimately, a strange and concerning legal move by their only son, Christopher Allen Hackman. Within a week of the discovery, Christopher filed a lawsuit in Santa Fe court to prevent the release of the autopsy reports, death investigation records, and even the photos taken by authorities at the scene. According to legal experts familiar with the case, this move was not only rare, but almost unheard of. Imagine the son of a deceased man and woman not only trying to conceal official records related to their deaths, but actively fighting in court to keep those details hidden from the public. Not only the photos, autopsy reports, investigation notes, toxicology results, and documents, things that in most states and in most cases are made public without question, were withheld. In New Mexico, such efforts require a compelling legal reason. Christopher argued that the couple's privacy and the family's right to grieve should be respected. But others, especially those involved in the investigation, saw something else. An attempt to cover up, a deliberate concealment. What was he trying to hide, and why? The timeline of Betsy Arakawa's death suddenly shifted a few days after investigators had believed she had passed. This is where the story transitions from tragedy to mystery, and from mystery to something even more unsettling. On February 12th, 2 weeks before the bodies were discovered, Arakawa was reported to have called a local medical clinic, speaking with a receptionist. She scheduled an appointment and appeared to still be alive. But according to police logs and initial reports, Arakawa was said to have died on February 11th, 1 day before that phone call. This contradiction brought the case to light. Suddenly, everything changed. How could a dead woman make a phone call? Was the initial death date wrong? Or was someone else trying to impersonate her? The local doctor who received the call confirmed the date and time. The phone records verified that this revelation alone completely changed the story, but that wasn't the only anomaly. Inside the house, authorities found signs suggesting that Hackman and Arakawa had died under very different circumstances, with different causes, in separate rooms, on different days. But still, no notes, no explanations, no signs. Just silent struggle, and now, secrecy. Then came the arrest of Christopher Allen Hackman, long seen as a reclusive and protected figure. He was taken into custody after documents were leaked that conflicted with key points in the family's legal records. While the full nature of the charges remained sealed, early details revealed that investigators were convinced Christopher not only accessed his parents' medical records, but also attempted to block, destroy, or manipulate official documents. Worse still, parts of the autopsy data were leaked, suggesting that one of the deaths may not have been natural at all. This video will take you through the entire story, from the moment Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa were found, to the chilling contradictions in the timeline, to the ensuing legal chaos, and finally to the explosive arrest of their son. Along the way, we will examine court documents, expert opinions, and testimony from those involved. We will question the motives behind the moral secrecy of withholding information from the public and the true implications of what happened inside that house. Because this story is not just about death, but about power, legacy, and the desperate actions people take when they fear the truth might be exposed. You'll hear medical experts confused by the timeline, legal professionals shocked by the nature of the court records, and investigative journalists following the clues, uncovering something far darker than anticipated. And perhaps the most haunting of all, you'll begin to understand why this case has caused so much unease. Because even now, with an arrest and a trail of paperwork, the answers are still incomplete. The questions only continue to multiply. Why did Christopher fight so fiercely to prevent the release of his parents' autopsy results? Why did he act to seal not just the images but the full report? What might those documents contain that he didn't want anyone to see? And why were Gene and Betsy found in separate rooms, days apart, in a home that had once been their refuge? As we begin this journey, we are not seeking simple conclusions. We are seeking the truth. And as you will see, the truth in this story may be far more complex than any headline could capture. This wasn't a story of old age and a peaceful passing, but rather a puzzle with missing pieces, wrong starts, and dead ends. But somewhere beneath the dust and silence lies the answer, and it begins right here. Let's begin. It was still dark on the morning of February 26, 2025, when the Santa Fe Sheriff's Department received a welfare check request from a concerned neighbor. The neighbor, who owned property across the mountain slope from the Hackman's home, had noticed something odd in the days before. No lights in the house, no movement, no sign of the morning routine that had been predictable for years, especially from Betsy, who would usually walk one of their 3 dogs at sunrise. The absence in a house that had been a regular presence in the quiet rural neighborhood for decades raised obvious concerns that wouldn't disappear. A neighbor finally called the non-emergency line. That one decision would trigger a chain of events no one could have foreseen. When the police arrived at the property, nestled deep in the cottonwoods of northern New Mexico, they immediately sensed something was wrong. Packages were left at the door, the mailbox was overflowing, a foul smell wafted from beneath a slightly recessed window near the side entrance, and there was no response when they knocked, no sounds from inside. Ultimately, with no other option and possibly a reason on their side, the police broke in. What they found inside was surreal. Gene Hackman, one of the most respected actors of his generation, was discovered dead in his upstairs study. He sat in an old leather chair, his head slightly tilted to one side as if he had simply fallen asleep and never awoke. a book resting on his lap. At first glance, there were no signs of injury or distress. His expression was calm, peaceful, even in his final moments. The police wondered if he had passed away naturally, perhaps while reading a book, undisturbed and at ease. But there was something in the air of the house, the silence, the strangeness, the stillness, that told them this was not an ordinary case. Betsy Arakawa was found 2 rooms away in the master bedroom, under entirely different circumstances. She was lying face down on the floor beside the bed, with no blanket covering her, no pillow under her head. Her body was stiff, indicating she had been dead for several days longer than her husband. There were no obvious injuries, no signs of a struggle, but her death didn't appear peaceful, accidental, or natural. And that was when the case shifted from unusual to deeply troubling. In the hallway between the 2 rooms, one of their 3 dogs, a shepherd mix named Kibbo, was also found dead. The other 2 dogs were missing, and their whereabouts wouldn't be confirmed for several days. The presence of the dead dog, combined with the silence of the others and the lack of any clear explanation, immediately raised questions about toxicology, poison, and neglect. Something was wrong, and the layout of the scene left investigators perplexed. How could both Gene and Betsy have died in the same house, so close to each other, without anyone knowing? Why were they in separate rooms? Why was there no sign of urgency, no distress calls? There were no signs that either of them knew the other was dying or had already passed. Had they been isolated before the incident, or was something else involved? What prevented either of them from reaching out? The sheriff's office was immediately called, along with the medical examiner's office. The 2 bodies were carefully taken for autopsy. The house was sealed, and crime scene technicians meticulously searched every inch, taking photos, collecting samples, and conducting a preliminary assessment. The quiet refuge of a couple who had fiercely protected their privacy was now a sealed crime scene, marked with tape and monitored by deputies within hours. News of Gene Hackman's death had leaked to the media, but what the public didn't know, and wouldn't know for several more days, was that his wife may have died before him. The official press release only stated that Hackman, 95, passed peacefully at home, with no mention of Arakawa, no reference to the dogs, and no details about the strange timeline or the unusual state of the house. The omission wasn't accidental. According to 2 investigators who later spoke anonymously, there was disagreement among officials from the start about how much to reveal and when. Some believed the public had the right to know the full story immediately, especially given Hackman's celebrity status. Others argued for caution, as the details were too vague and the cause of death unclear. Prematurely releasing information could jeopardize the investigation or cause panic in the community. The coroner's office faced pressure to act quickly, but with minimal physical evidence, they began conducting parallel tests on the bodies. Initial findings showed no blunt force trauma, no gunshot wounds, and no clear signs of foul play. But something still didn't feel right. Toxicology screening would take longer, and tissue samples were sent to laboratories statewide, with Tom working against the clock. Meanwhile, law enforcement began reviewing the external footage from Gene and Betsy's property, as Hackman and Betsy had installed a basic surveillance system at their home. The system was primarily used to monitor wildlife and visitors, but strangely, footage from 2 weeks prior was missing. The hard drive had been erased, and the physical DVR device remained intact in the living room, plugged in, but the internal storage had been cleared, serving only as a shell for investigators. This was the first clear sign that someone had tampered with the scene, suggesting that this wasn't just a tragic double death, but likely something much more sinister. The neighbors were interviewed, and no one reported hearing anything unusual. No visitors, no signs of a break-in, no loud arguments or disturbances. The couple was known to be quiet and introverted, keeping to themselves, but even in their isolation, neighbors found it strange that no one had seen Betsy for nearly 2 weeks since the beginning of February, and no one had seen Gene for at least 5 days. When asked why they hadn't reported sooner, most neighbors admitted they assumed the couple had gone on a retreat or were simply avoiding the winter weather. The Hackman family had a habit of disappearing for extended periods, and this time, there was no reason for concern until the forensic team spent over 3 days searching the property. The rooms were cataloged, medications were recorded, every bottle in the kitchen, every container in the garage, every drawer in the bathroom was searched. The computer was seized, and the mobile phone was collected, but once again, a strange detail emerged. Betsy's jeans and phone had both been disconnected. The last activity from both devices was a text message sent from Betsy's phone on February 11th, a simple message to a friend, hoping to meet again. That friend later told reporters that the message seemed generic, unlike Betsy's usual warm and thoughtful texts. It wasn't until a phone call on February 12th to a nearby clinic was discovered that the case truly began to unravel. A receptionist at the clinic confirmed that Betsy had called at 9:15 a.m. She was concerned about chest tightness and requested an appointment for that weekend. She didn't seem disoriented or weak. She was alert, calm, and specific. The appointment was scheduled for February 15th, but Betsy never showed up. A phone call would throw the official timeline into chaos. If Betsy was alive on February 12th, why did investigators believe she died on the 11th? Could the body's date of death have been misrecorded, or were the drill hole or other biological evidence misinterpreted? Or, more alarmingly, was someone using her phone to simulate her presence? Investigators returned to the house and began reconstructing the timeline based on physical clues rather than assumptions. The meal preparation in the kitchen, with a half-used loaf of bread and a plate of wilted vegetables, suggested someone had been active after the 11th. However, dust samples on a nearby bookshelf and a fresh grocery delivery receipt contradicted that timeline. Everything overlapped, conflicted, and grew increasingly nonsensical as they examined the details more closely. Now, the sheriff's department began to suspect that a family member might have entered the house before the bodies were found. Someone with access, someone with motive. When they inquired about who held the spare keys, one name emerged: Christopher Allen Hackman. Gene Hackman was never the type to seek attention, even during the decades when he was one of Hollywood's most sought-after and admired actors. There was always something about him that made him stand out. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, and he didn't immerse himself in the glamour of red carpets or stage media frenzies. Instead, Hackman built a respected career through sheer talent, precision, and a raw emotional presence that audiences could feel in every role he portrayed. He was an artist who vanished into the characters that brought to life figures like Popeye Doyle in The French Connection and Little Bill Daggett in Unforgiven, yet off-screen, he was nearly invisible. Born in San Bernardino, California, in 1930, Eugene Allen Hackman's life was marked by early struggles. His father left when he was 13, and his mother died when he was young. He enlisted in the Marine Corps at 16 by falsifying his age and spent several years traveling the world before considering a career in acting. He was not formally trained, nor did he attend prestigious conservatories. Instead, he built his career slowly and methodically through off-Broadway stages and guest TV roles until Hollywood could no longer ignore him. By the 1970s, he had become one of America's quintessential actors of his time. But even at the peak of his fame, Hackman remained elusive. He rarely granted interviews, refused to be part of the celebrity machine, and never moved to Los Angeles permanently. After his final film role in 2004's Welcome to Mooseport, Hackman completely retired from acting. There were no press tours, no farewell appearances, just a quiet departure. He spent the rest of his life in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with Betsy Arakawa, the woman he met in the 1980s when she worked at a gym he frequented. At that time, Hackman was still recovering from a difficult divorce. His first marriage ended after 3 children and decades of personal and professional pressure. His relationship with Betsy, who was over 30 years younger and had a calmer, simpler personality, contrasted with his own. Friends of the couple described their relationship as stable, even peaceful. Together, they built a home not only in architectural terms but emotionally, creating a space deliberately separated from the chaos of Hollywood where they could maintain privacy and their routines. Betsy Arakawa has her own story, though it is rarely reported. Born in Hawaii in 1959, she was trained as a classical pianist from a young age. Her discipline and artistry earned her recognition early in life, but she never sought fame. After moving to Los Angeles to pursue music, she eventually shifted to business, co-owning a furniture store with a friend and taking on various side jobs to make a living. During that time, she met Gene, a man respected in the industry but weary of its demands. They connected quietly, almost accidentally, and stayed together for the rest of their lives. The couple's home in Santa Fe was a sanctuary, surrounded by cottonwood trees, desert winds, and carefully shielded from public intrusion. They lived with a group of dogs for many years, adopting rescued dogs and integrating them into their daily life. The neighbors only knew them as a polite, quiet couple who occasionally waved but never threw parties or sought attention. Hackman painted in his later years, while Betsy continued to play the piano, usually for herself, sometimes for friends. Their lives were slow, careful, and intensely private. That's why their deaths, under any circumstances, were shocking, especially under these. It wasn't just that they had passed, but the strange, disjointed nature of the events left friends and acquaintances stunned. For decades, the Hackman family managed to live away from scandal, rumors, and extravagance. They fiercely protected their privacy, and that decision shielded them from the public scrutiny that many other high-profile figures face. Even tabloid newspapers left them alone. They became a model for post-Hollywood life, a vision of peace and retirement. But now that carefully guarded privacy has been shattered. 2 bodies in separate rooms, no clear cause of death, an illogical timeline, and a son in custody. Investigators whisper about the inconsistencies, the blocked autopsy reports, and a dog found dead in the hallway. To the world, Gene Hackman is a legend to his fans. He was one of the last giants of Hollywood's golden age, managing to escape the industry's decline with his dignity intact. But inside the walls of the Santa Fe home, those accolades meant little. There, he was simply Gene, a retired actor painting landscapes, walking the dog, tending to a modest garden with his wife, cooking simple meals, and reading history books. To most, he was thought to be cheerful, or at least content. Betsy was the emotional backbone of their home. Despite being decades younger than him, she never viewed their relationship as a transaction. She wasn't someone chasing fame or opportunity. Friends say she admired Gene's intellect more than his celebrity. She enjoyed classical music, yoga, and gardening. She managed the family finances and ensured their life was as grounded as possible. No staff, no housekeepers, just the two of them growing older together in their own way. This raises the question of how everything could have gone so terribly wrong. In such a tightly controlled, peaceful environment, in the days following the discovery of the body, many close to the couple began to reflect on the recent months. Were there any signs of health issues? Did anyone mention depression? Some friends recalled that Betsy seemed more withdrawn lately, especially after a minor surgery at the end of 2024. She had canceled 2 social gatherings in January. Jane, on the other hand, seemed unchanged, certainly older but still sharp and full of her usual dry humor. A friend noted that at the end of February, just days before the news broke, she had texted Betsy to ask about their annual dog rescue fundraising event. The message was never answered. At the time, she assumed Betsy was just busy, but now she wonders if the silence had already begun. Adding another layer of complexity is the role of their son, Christopher Allen Hackman. Although he is not Betsy's biological son, Christopher had spent a lot of time with the couple in Santa Fe, especially in recent years. He is seen by some as distant, while others defend their relationship. Their relationship was never considered warm, but it was consistent. He is the executor of Hackman's will, involved in maintaining the house, and now, with both his parents gone, he is the one filing to block their autopsy reports. Some longtime friends of the couple hesitated to speak on the record, but off-camera they expressed concerns not only about the death, but also the consequences surrounding an old colleague. Hackman simply said, "There's something wrong with this. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Not with Gene Hackman. Not with Betsy Arakawa. After decades of staying out of the public eye, they have now become the center of a media storm and possibly a criminal investigation. Their names, once associated with quiet excellence and deliberate absence, are now entangled in secrets, sealed court records, and unanswered questions." The victims were not just 2 individuals found in separate rooms. The victims were also their legacy, their story, and the truth now obscured by conflicting timelines, legal records, and the increasingly suspicious behavior of their son. They had built a life that should have been lived in peace, but in death, that life shattered. As investigators delved deeper into the days leading up to their deaths, the broken pieces of that story grew darker and more troubling. There was something intentional when authorities first entered the Hackman home on February 26th. They believed they were encountering an unusual but potentially explainable tragedy. The bodies of Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, were found in separate rooms, with one of their 3 dogs lying dead nearby. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no signs of forced entry or struggle. The initial conclusion leaned toward natural causes, possibly illness or accidental exposure to some toxin, perhaps a tragic coincidence but not unprecedented. Older couples, especially those with deep emotional bonds, sometimes die a few days apart. This theory seemed plausible until it no longer did. It began to become clear when the Office of the Medical Investigator started reconstructing the sequence of events based on initial physical evidence. According to Betsy's body condition, her estimated time of death was determined to be between February 10th and 11. On the other hand, Gene's death appeared to have occurred more recently, around February 20th to 22. This meant that the couple didn't die together or even within a few days of each other, but rather about a week apart. And during that week, someone had been in the house or deliberately allowed entry. It remained intact, even though Betsy's body had lain undetected in the master bedroom since that time. Nothing about the case appeared typical as investigators began combing through the couple's digital traces, mobile phone records, security logs, internet usage, grocery deliveries, doctor's appointments. They were looking to confirm the exact timeline of when Gene and Betsy last interacted with the outside world. What they found only deepened the mystery. On February 12th, a call was made from the landline of the house to a local clinic in Santa Fe. The call lasted just under 4 minutes, with the receptionist confirming that the voice on the line was calm and coherent. The caller introduced herself as Betsy Arakawa and requested an appointment due to chest pain she had experienced the previous evening. The receptionist scheduled an appointment for her on February 15th, which Betsy accepted. The call was recorded and then quickly forgotten until the investigation began. This detail prompted a significant shift in how investigators approached the case. If Betsy truly died on February 11th, how did she call the clinic the following day? Did she make the call herself, or could someone else have used her name? Was the initial forensic estimate of her time of death incorrect? The timing of the call was verified with the clinic's phone records. No mistakes, no discrepancies. Moreover, the receptionist's statement was clear. She knew Betsy. They had spoken before, and it was her voice on the phone, sounding normal, without any sense of urgency or distress. So what could explain the contradiction? Investigators returned to forensic analysis, reconsidering the physical condition of Betsy's body, which may have been misunderstood. In rare cases, environmental factors, such as room temperature, airflow, and body positioning can cause post-mortem changes to appear earlier or later than they actually occurred. But the discrepancy here was too significant. Days, not hours. Even with a broad margin of error, it didn't align. Adding to the confusion, the delivery records indicated a grocery delivery on February 13th. A local driver had delivered a small order to the Hackman house around midday. The groceries were left at the front door for delivery instructions. When asked, the driver recalled nothing unusual. The order had been prepaid, and no one came to the door, but the groceries were gone when he passed by the house that afternoon. Who brought them inside? If Betsy had been dead since February 11th, and Gene was believed to have passed after February 20th, that left a 9-day gap during which someone else could have been in the house. This began to raise serious concerns. Did Christopher Hackman visit the house during that time? Could he have found Betsy's body and claimed there was nothing amiss? Could he have altered the crime scene in some way to make it appear as though her death occurred earlier than it actually did? Digital forensics revealed that both Gene and Betsy's phones were turned off on February 13th, within hours of the grocery delivery. Prior to that, the phones had been minimally active, but after February 13th there was nothing. No pings, no usage, no location data, almost as if someone had deliberately turned them off or destroyed their connection. Surveillance footage, once thought to be the gold mine of answers, turned out to be another dead end. The home's DVR system had been wiped clean. The device was still operating and plugged in, but its memory had been erased. When forensic technicians examined it further, they found that it had been manually reset using the factory reset protocol. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This move wasn't accidental, but deliberate. The timeline now looks like this. Betsy was last seen or heard directly on February 12th when she called her clinic. Her body was later found on the 26th, but it's likely she died earlier, possibly as late as the 13th. Gene was believed to have been alive at least until the 20th. The grocery order was delivered on the 13th and disappeared. The phone was turned off that same day. Surveillance footage may have been deleted on or after the 14th, and somewhere in that chain of events, the house became a silent tomb. At this point, investigators turned their attention to Christopher. He hadn't been in regular contact with his father in the weeks leading up to the death. Phone records showed no calls or messages between them after mid-January, but bank records revealed he used a shared household credit account on February 16th, with a $74 transaction logged at a hardware store in Santa Fe, just 10 miles from his parents' home. Investigators cross-referenced store surveillance footage and found a man resembling Christopher entering at 1:43 p.m., purchasing a standard household toolkit, gloves, and a roll of industrial trash bags. The footage was blurry, and the man wore a hat and mask, but the timing couldn't be overlooked. Further analysis revealed another anomaly. The Wi-Fi-enabled thermostat in the Hackman home recorded a sudden drop in temperature on the night of February 13th, from a stable 70 degrees to 58 degrees. System logs indicated the change was made manually through the home's app interface. Investigators subpoenaed IP data and tracked logins to a device registered to Christopher. The pieces of the puzzle started to fit together. They began developing a new theory, one suggesting that the events were not a tragic accident, but a deliberate cover-up. According to this theory, Betsy might have died suddenly, possibly from natural causes or self-inflicted harm. Gene, isolated and overwhelmed, could have passed away a few days later, unable to cope. But this scenario didn't account for the deleted footage, the tampered electronics, or transactions made for cleanup supplies. A more troubling theory began to emerge, that Christopher discovered the crime scene possibly days after Betsy's death, and instead of calling for rescue or notifying authorities, he chose to conceal the fact that he had entered the house, turned off the phone, wiped the DVR, adjusted the thermostat to slow decomposition, and tried to handle the scene himself. But why? Was it to protect his father's legacy, shield the family from scrutiny? Or was there something in the house, something tied to the death, that he didn't want investigators to find? The autopsy results were still pending, but the pressure was mounting. The media increasingly began reporting on an unusual timeline. Journalists raised more probing questions, but the family refused to comment. Christopher hired legal counsel and issued a single public statement through his lawyer. The family requested privacy during this unimaginable time of loss and grief. But privacy in this case quickly gave way to suspicion. Investigators knew that the answers they were seeking lay within the timeline, the exact moments when the phone was turned off, when the thermostat was adjusted, when groceries were brought inside, when the security system was wiped clean. Each action spoke to the familiarity and motive of someone, and the deeper they delved, one name kept appearing in nearly every investigation of the deaths of famous individuals. There is a relatively predictable protocol. Authorities complete their assessments, medical examiners finalize their reports, and after a brief internal review, the autopsy results and case files are made public through official records requests or direct release. This is not just standard practice but a legal matter in many jurisdictions, including New Mexico. These processes are sometimes painful for surviving family members, but they exist to ensure transparency, especially when questions arise about the cause or circumstances of death. However, in the case of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa, the process came to a sudden halt, less than a week after their bodies were found and removed from their home in Santa Fe. Their only son, Christopher Allen Hackman, filed an emergency petition. The Santa Fe District Court filed a petition requesting the court to issue an immediate temporary injunction against both the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office and the New Mexico Medical Investigator's Office. His goal was to prevent the public release of any and all images, videos, and documents related to the deaths of his father and stepmother. Such a legal filing raised eyebrows in both the legal and law enforcement communities, not only due to its timing but also its scope. Christopher wasn't simply requesting the sealing of sensitive photos, a request not uncommon in high-profile death cases. He was attempting to block the release of the entire autopsy report, toxicology summary, investigative notes, and even internal communications between agencies. According to legal experts, the scope of the filing was described as extremely aggressive and nearly unprecedented. To understand the legal implications, it's important to note that New Mexico law does not grant families the automatic right to block the release of autopsy results. In fact, the state's law treats these records as public documents with very few exceptions, primarily related to ongoing investigations or cases where release would jeopardize public safety. Without these exceptions, even the families of deceased public figures have very few remedies. This is what made Christopher's legal move so startling. His attorneys argued that releasing the autopsy results, especially photos and video footage, would violate the family's constitutional rights, specifically their 14th Amendment right to privacy and their right to mourn without public intrusion. The filing referenced previous cases, including similar legal efforts by the families of Michael Jackson and Helena Hutchins, where judges had sealed autopsy photos or restricted media access to death scene evidence. However, in those cases, the restrictions were carefully tailored. In this case, Christopher's team had requested the complete sealing of the court records. It quickly became a closely watched topic, with legal analysts beginning to dissect it on national news broadcasts. Commentators questioned the motivation behind such a broad request. If there was nothing suspicious about the deaths, why seek to seal even the non-illustrative sections of the report? Why block toxicology results? Why try to silence findings from licensed medical investigators? Questions were raised, but the answers were not forthcoming. The language of the petition emphasized Gene and Betsy's private lifestyle, stating that the couple had deliberately chosen to live out of the public eye for over 30 years, and that the invasion of privacy after their deaths would violate their long-held values. The document claimed that Gene Hackman did not live for the public and should not be dissected after his death. It also stated that Betsy Arakawa had never sought fame, and that the couple had the right to live peacefully even after death. For many, this argument resonated emotionally. After all, Gene Hackman had built his retirement life around isolation and a deliberate distance from public life. He had turned down countless interviews, rejected publicity, and avoided attention at every opportunity. But even the most sympathetic observers were puzzled by one aspect of the petition. It didn't just request privacy, it demanded silence. It sought to block access to any official findings that could shed light on what really happened inside that house. A specific clause in Section 3B of this motion drew attention. Christopher's attorneys included a line requesting the court to order investigators to disclose or reference any preliminary conclusions, laboratory reports, or timeline data that could infer the cause, manner, or timing of death. They requested the court to prevent even discussing what could have led to the couple's passing. Legal experts quickly pointed out how rare such a request was. A retired judge noted that in her 30 years on the bench, she had never seen a petitioner attempt to block the inference of a time of death. The suggestion that even the sequence of events should be protected raised doubts that the timeline itself could be damaging. The sheriff's office and the medical investigation team responded swiftly in their rebuttal filing. They argued that releasing the autopsy report was not only standard procedure, but also a legal obligation under the state's public records law. They acknowledged the family's desire for privacy, but emphasized that transparency was essential to maintain public trust, especially in a case that had garnered national attention. They went further, arguing that attempts to block the release of basic facts could be seen as obstruction in an ongoing investigation. While they stopped short of accusing Christopher of any wrongdoing, the language of the response hinted at growing frustration among investigators. The phrase "lack of cooperation from the family" appeared multiple times in the records. Meanwhile, local journalists began submitting public records requests in anticipation of the autopsy report's release. When these requests were denied while awaiting the court's decision, several media outlets joined forces to file an amicus brief supporting public access. The New Mexico Press Association, along with several national news organizations, argued that the public interest in the case outweighed the family's right to privacy. They pointed to the unusual circumstances surrounding the deaths, the gaps in the timeline, and the unprecedented nature of the legal effort to keep the case sealed. The summary included an incriminating statement. When public figures die under mysterious circumstances, and their surviving family members try to prevent the release of factual findings, the result is not peace. Doubt creeps in, and public opinion begins to shift. Online forums, social media threads, and news comment sections are flooded with speculation. Is what Christopher is trying to hide to protect his family or himself? Ironically, the court records have attracted more attention to the case than any autopsy report ever could. Under increasing pressure, the judge presiding over the case scheduled an emergency hearing to address the injunction. Both sides were given 3 days to prepare their arguments. The hearing was closed to the public, but leaked information from those familiar with the proceedings revealed it was a heated debate. Christopher's legal team reiterated their constitutional argument, citing psychological harm to surviving family members. The state countered by pointing out that the report was complete and ready for release, and sealing it would undermine the integrity of the entire investigation. As detectives continued to investigate inconsistencies in the timeline, deleted footage, and strange behavior surrounding the days between the deaths, the court's decision became crucial. If the judge sided with Christopher, investigators feared they would be hindered in sharing key findings with the public and possibly even with other agencies. But if the judge ruled in favor of the state, everything that happened inside the Hackman estate would finally be brought to light. But before the judge could make a ruling, another development changed everything. A leak. An anonymous source close to the investigation provided excerpts from the autopsy report. These excerpts were sent to a local journalist who then shared them with national media outlets. Although only partial, the content contradicted many of the implications in the family's legal filings. Toxicology results showed high levels of sedatives in both Gene and Betsy's systems, enough to suggest regular or recent use, though not a fatal dose. The report noted signs consistent with controlled dosage, raising even more questions. The timeline estimates provided in the report also contradicted the initial assumptions presented in Christopher's petition. The leak sparked a media firestorm, making the pending court ruling irrelevant. Information had been made public, the truth was out, and now investigators had even more drive to pursue the case. Leaked excerpts from the autopsy report had just begun circulating, and public interest exploded. A strange yet relatively quiet case, mostly discussed within legal and entertainment circles, suddenly became breaking news across national networks. Talk shows debated the ethics of sealing the autopsy report, while online platforms lit up with speculation, outrage, and curiosity. Within hours, the names Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa became trending on social media, not for their careers or legacy, but because of a mystery that had just turned darker. Details in the leaked report raised concerns for many. High levels of sedatives, signs of controlled substance use, conflicting timeline assessments. These weren't conclusions, but questions disguised as discoveries, and for the public, who had largely respected their privacy in the days following the couple's death, the tone now shifted abruptly. What exactly is Christopher hiding about what happened inside that house? And could the deaths of these two very private individuals not only be surrounded by tragedy, but also manipulated? Or worse? Social media has become the first battleground, where reactions erupted. Twitter, Reddit, and Facebook were flooded with theories. Some users, especially those familiar with true crime forums, immediately analyzed the available information with clinically accurate themes, mapping out inconsistencies in the timeline, suggesting everything from a random poisoning to a deliberate cover-up. Others questioned the role of law enforcement. Was the investigation thorough enough? Why wasn't the public informed about the strange occurrences sooner? Was someone in the sheriff's department involved in keeping everything quiet? Among the loudest voices, could they be Gene Hackman's most dedicated fans? A surprising number of them aren't typical online participants. Many are longtime fans who have followed Hackman's career from the days of The French Connection through his final performance in Welcome to Mooseport. These are the people who remember his late-night TV interviews, watched him accept his Oscar, and saw him gracefully disappear from the public eye. If you find this story interesting and want to learn more, leave a comment with the number 1. If not, leave a comment with the number 0. Now let's continue with this fascinating story. For them, the idea that his legacy is now shrouded in secrecy and controversy feels like a betrayal. Some express sympathy for Christopher, believing he's trying to protect his father's dignity. Others don't forgive him, arguing that hiding information only breeds suspicion. The media began reporting on editorials and commentaries with their own perspectives. A columnist from the Los Angeles Times wrote that the public has a right to know, especially when public figures pass under unclear circumstances. Another columnist from the New York Times took a more cautious approach, questioning the ethics of leaked medical information and warning against rushing to judgment in the media. But perhaps the most impactful piece came from a writer in Santa Fe, who had interviewed Hackman in the early 2000s. In her article, she described the couple's love for their home, their privacy, and their determination to keep their identities hidden. Her conclusion was simple yet sharp. Hackman didn't want to be remembered in this way, and yet here we are, offline. The local community in Santa Fe is struggling with a different reaction, shocked that something so strange, filled with mystery, had happened right among them. Hackman's neighbors, many of whom only spoke to them in passing, were approached by journalists and photographers seeking statements or images. Most declined. A few described the couple as kind, reserved, and devoted to their privacy. The intrusion, some said, felt like a violation. At a local cafe, a laminated sign was posted on the register. No questions about the hackers' thanks for respecting their memory. Meanwhile, investigative reporters continued to push for answers with legal records now made public, and the leak confirmed previously speculated details. The media began pointing out the connection between the inconsistencies in the timeline and Christopher's legal actions. Why would a son, even one deeply grieving, go to such extraordinary lengths to conceal not only the image but the truth? What was it that he feared people might learn? Christopher's silence did nothing to help, aside from his lawyer's initial statement. He declined all interviews, held no press conferences, provided no written responses, and stayed off social media. That communication void became fertile ground for more theories. People began digging into his background, searching for clues that could explain his motives. Some focused on his financial records, while rumors spread that Christopher had long been estranged from his father, and although those reports were never confirmed, they persisted. Some blogs claimed that he had mounting debts possibly linked to a failed business venture in Oregon. Others speculated that inheritance and real estate plans could have played a role. If Gene had excluded him or restricted his access to funds, he might have had a reason to conceal potentially damaging revelations. Still, others speculated that the story was more personal, suggesting there could be family secrets no one wanted to reveal, a history of conflict, a falling out, a fear that the public might judge Gene or Betsy for personal issues unrelated to their deaths. Amidst the growing speculation, a darker story emerged among conspiracy theorists on fringe forums. The narrative took on a new form. Some users suggested foul play, claiming that Christopher was directly involved in the deaths, and that the sedatives found during the autopsy had been deliberately administered. The timing of the phone being turned off and the security footage being deleted wasn't just suspicious, it pointed to guilt. Theories, although unsupported by any confirming evidence, quickly garnered attention. Due to the silence from both law enforcement and the family, it wasn't long before true crime YouTubers and podcasters joined the conversation, tapping into channels with millions of subscribers. They began uploading in-depth analysis videos about the case, complete with animated timelines, reenactments of speculation, and emotional appeals. Some videos went viral, with one popular channel known for its methodical approach to unsolved cases, releasing a 50-minute expose that garnered nearly 4 million views in just 3 days. Its point was clear. Someone had changed the circumstances at the Hackman home, and whoever they were, they had access to knowledge and motive. In the court of public opinion, silence was no longer an option. People wanted answers. They wanted context. And above all, they wanted the truth. Not the version sanitized by the family, but the full picture. Even if it was painful, even if it caused trouble for the Santa Fe Sheriff's Department, this wave of attention had created mounting pressure. Investigators now found themselves tasked not only with solving a complex case, but also with defending their process. Why was the family's request taken so seriously? What had investigators overlooked? Were they influenced by the Hackman name? Several press conferences were held to reassure the public that the investigation remained objective and thorough. In one such conference, a spokesperson for the department stated that while they could not comment on the specifics of the autopsy, they acknowledged the unusual nature of the case and were pursuing all leads with equal diligence. The statement was vague, but it signaled something important. Officials no longer viewed the deaths as entirely natural or accidental. The case had become public and was now considered a possible crime. As public scrutiny grew tighter, calls for transparency intensified, and advocacy groups began pushing for changes to New Mexico's public records laws. One organization, the Media Integrity Center, proposed a new bill aimed at preventing families from blocking autopsy reports without clear harm. Their stance was simple. Transparency protects both the public and the family of the deceased. Concealing the truth, they believed, only fueled conspiracy. In a strange turn, the debate over privacy and access became a nationwide topic of discussion. Television programs featured ethicists, former law enforcement officials, and journalists debating the line between respect and secrecy. When does protecting a family's pain become an obstruction? Is there ever a valid reason to seal an entire autopsy report? And how should authorities address these conflicts when the deceased is a public figure with a long-lasting legacy? In the midst of all this, the memory of Gene Hackman began to shift. Not intentionally, but inevitably. As a new cycle continued to stir his film career, his achievements, his acting, and his legacy began to fade into the background. Instead, a story was being built on silence, mystery, and suspicion for the fans who had admired him for decades. The change was painful for those seeking answers, something unavoidable. However, what remained unchanged was the public's desire to know the truth, not out of morbid curiosity, but to find closure, to restore a story carefully built over decades and then shattered in a matter of days. People wanted to believe that Gene Hackman passed away peacefully in the loving embrace of a home he had carefully built. But the truth does not support that version, and until those truths are fully exposed, the questions will only continue to grow. After the leaked autopsy report, all eyes turned to one person, Christopher Allen Hackman. Until recently, his name was almost unknown outside of close circles in Hollywood or the biographical captions he managed, whether by choice or circumstance, to live in the shadow of a man many regarded as a film giant. Gene Hackman's legacy looms large, but Christopher has kept himself distant from its center. That all changed with a single court record and the ripple effect of a mystery that could no longer remain silent. Who is Christopher Allen Hackman? The question hangs in the air as journalists investigate and the public begins to uncover the figure at the center of a growing storm. What they find is a man of contrasts, contradictions, and increasing controversy. Born in 1960, Christopher is the first of 3 children Gene Hackman had with his first wife, Fa Maltese. By the time he was born, Hackman still had many years ahead before breaking into mainstream cinema. He struggled with odd jobs, took on small roles, and fought to make a name for himself in a notoriously ruthless industry. His dedication to his craft consumed much of his time, and many who knew the family during those years spoke of the toll it took on his marriage and relationship with his children. Christopher's early life was not defined by the glamour of Hollywood, but by the instability in the life of an ambitious artist. The family moved frequently during Christopher's childhood. Hackman's schedule was erratic as he ultimately achieved breakthrough success in the late 1960s with his role in Bonnie and Clyde and his subsequent relationship with the French. The sudden fame only intensified the scrutiny, which, while welcomed in his professional career, brought a harsher gaze on his personal life. Hackman's marriage to Maltese began to deteriorate when Christopher was a teenager. His parents' divorce was finalized in 1986, when Christopher was in his mid-20s. Friends from that time recall a young man caught between resentment and reverence. He admired his father's talent, but felt anger over his father's absence. There had been attempts to connect over the years, with holiday visits and occasional public appearances, but a physical and emotional distance always remained. Unlike many children of actors, Christopher never sought a place in the film industry. He dabbled in photography, then architecture, and later tried a series of business ventures, each with varying levels of success. None of them made headlines, and none lasted into the 1990s. Christopher had almost vanished from the public eye. He settled in Oregon for a time, reportedly running a small design consulting business. He married in the late 1990s, had no children, and lived a quiet, isolated life with those around him. But quiet didn't necessarily mean stable. A court records review revealed at least 2 civil lawsuits filed against him for breach of contract, both of which were settled out of court. In one case, a former client accused Christopher of mismanaging funds for property renovations. The case was never tried, but the documents suggested a man struggling to maintain his projects. There are few public records about Christopher's relationship with Gene. In the 2000s, Hackman retired and rarely mentioned his children in interviews. In a few rare accounts, he spoke of them fondly, but without providing specific details. A 2004 interview with the Denver Post briefly quoted him, "My kids are doing well. I'm proud of what they've become. No names, no details." However, sources close to the family suggest that the relationship between Gene and Christopher had grown closer in the past decade. The move to Santa Fe seemed to offer an opportunity for reconciliation. Christopher visited the house multiple times throughout the year, sometimes during holidays, other times without prior notice. He helped with small repairs, occasionally accompanied his father to doctor's appointments, and began assisting with some real estate plans. He wasn't close with Betsy, according to neighbors, but their relationship was polite. She introduced him as Gene's son, not as my stepson. They were courteous, formal, and mostly kept their distance. That difference became more pronounced in recent years, according to a longtime friend of Betsy, with tension surrounding the family trust. Gene had rewritten portions of his will in 2018 and again in 2021. The details of those amendments were sealed, but the changes were believed to have restructured the distribution of assets in a way that reduced Christopher's control over key properties. Betsy, by then in her 60s, had taken on more responsibilities in managing their joint assets and finances, and she was known to be cautious with spending. It's unclear how this creates a conflict, but the timing coincides with Christopher suddenly stopping his frequent visits in the months leading up to Gene and Betsy's deaths. There were few signs of public conflict, but also very little warmth. Christopher had not visited since early January. He did not respond to holiday cards from his father. A voicemail left by Gene on January 9th asking Christopher to call when he could was never returned. These details, while not inherently suspicious, began to paint a picture that was either tense or indifferent. When news of Gene and Betsy's deaths broke, many expected Christopher to make a statement or appear publicly, yet he did neither. His absence during the initial investigation was particularly notable. It wasn't until 6 days later that Christopher's lawyers filed a request to block the release of the autopsy reports, and by that time, public scrutiny had begun to turn toward him. In the following weeks, more basic details began to emerge. Financial records examined by reporters revealed that Christopher had recently taken out a short-term loan secured by a secondary property in Oregon. The loan had been filed just a month before Gene Hackman's death, listing his name as the guarantor. A strange detail raised red flags. There was an administrative error regarding the forged signature, or perhaps Gene had agreed to support the loan without knowing the broader implications. Investigators have not released their findings on this matter, but court records show that the signature on the guarantor line did not match previously verified samples of Gene's. Handwriting analysts from Hackman's legal team are said to have been called in to assess the documents. While no charges have been immediately filed, the implications are deeply concerning. If Christopher forged his father's signature on a legitimate financial document, it could indicate deeper financial desperation and might also reveal a motive, especially if inheritance or control of property were part of the equation. Then there was the footage from the hardware store, where a man identified as Christopher was seen purchasing gloves and trash bags on February 16th. He was alone, wearing a hat and a face mask. While his identity had not been officially confirmed by the police, sources close to the investigation said the resemblance was striking, and additional surveillance from a nearby gas station seemed to show the same car he was known to drive. Why did he buy those items? What was their purpose? If he had discovered his stepmother's body earlier in the month, why wait to call the authorities? Why purchase items typically associated with cleaning or covering up? Christopher's lawyer declined to comment on the footage, but reiterated that their client had fully cooperated with law enforcement and had not committed any wrongdoing. However, investigators seemed unconvinced, and a search warrant for Christopher's residence in Oregon was issued, with several electronic devices seized. No formal charges were filed at that time, but insiders believed the case was rapidly escalating. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, some supporters gathered to defend Christopher. Friends from his Oregon community described him as quiet, even shy. He had volunteered at a local animal rescue, helped an elderly neighbor rebuild a deck, and had once assisted in evacuating residents during a wildfire. These were not the actions of a man preparing to cover up, they argued. Rather, they were the actions of a kind person, though emotionally distant. However, references to his character could only go so far. Investigators pieced together the timeline and reevaluated the autopsy findings, and Christopher's actions, or lack thereof, began to weigh more heavily in the unfolding investigation. The gap between February 11th and February 26th remains unexplained. Why was the house left untouched? Why was no one called? Why was there no official acknowledgement of the deaths until a suspicious neighbor stepped forward? And most importantly, why did Christopher aggressively file to prevent anyone from learning more about the growing cloud of uncertainty surrounding the case? Here is a man whose life was defined by darkness, not by crime, not by scandal, but by absence. He had tried to hide for decades, and now, suddenly, he was the most closely watched person in a case that had captured national attention. Whether he had something to hide or was simply overwhelmed by grief and fear, the truth remained that his actions had drawn attention. And once that attention was focused on him, it wouldn't let go. On the morning of March 10, 2025, just 2 weeks after court records heightened the tension surrounding the deaths of Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa, Christopher Allen Hackman was arrested by the Santa Fe Sheriff's Department. The arrest marked a significant turning point in a case that had captured the public and media's intense focus, following increasing evidence suggesting that the son of the late actor and pianist might have been more involved in the deaths of his parents than anyone had initially suspected. The arrest was the result of weeks of investigation, during which law enforcement meticulously examined digital traces, financial records, witness testimony, and surveillance footage. While no formal charges had been filed at this point, authorities had built a strong case. Christopher had deliberately altered key details about the deaths and may have played a direct role in the events surrounding them. He was arrested at his home in Oregon. The arrest was quiet, with little fanfare. By the time news outlets reported on it, he had been transferred to a detention facility in Santa Fe, where he was briefly interrogated before being officially charged with obstruction of justice and potentially being involved in the deaths of his parents. The charges related to his attempt to block the autopsy, his suspected role in tampering with evidence, and newly emerging financial motives linked to inheritance, along with his strained relationship with his father, all played a significant role in his arrest. The arrest was a meticulously planned operation, based on a wealth of circumstantial evidence. Investigators focused on Christopher's activities in the days leading up to the death, including his suspicious purchase of cleaning supplies from a local hardware store on February 16th. Security footage from the store showed a man resembling Christopher buying gloves, trash bags, and industrial cleaning supplies. While it's still unclear whether these items were used to clean the Hackman home, their presence raised enough questions to warrant further investigation. His refusal to answer calls from his father in January, along with the complete lack of contact after the death, only fueled further suspicion. Additionally, a forensic audit of Christopher's financial records revealed that he had recently taken out a short-term loan. For a property he owned in Oregon, loan documents listed Gene Hackman as the guarantor, although investigators discovered anomalies in the signature that they believe indicate potential forgery. While this alone was not enough to prove guilt, it added another layer of suspicion to Christopher's activities and his financial motives. Another crucial factor in the arrest was the discovery of digital evidence linking Christopher to the Santa Fe home after his parents' deaths. Mobile phone records showed that on February 13th, 2 days after Betts's body was likely discovered, Christopher's phone had pinged local cell towers near Hackman's residence. This raised further questions about his whereabouts during the critical period between the couple's deaths and the final discovery of their bodies. Furthermore, investigators discovered that Christopher had remotely logged into the house's temperature control system on February 13th, lowering the temperature inside the home. This unusual action aligned with efforts to slow down the decomposition process, but also indicated that Christopher was aware of the bodies and was actively managing the crime scene. While the digital evidence was damning, it was his interference with the security footage that ultimately led to Christopher's arrest. When investigators first examined the surveillance system at the house, they discovered that the DVR had been reset, and all video footage from the week leading up to the discovery of the bodies had been deleted. Further analysis revealed that the system had been manually reset using a specific reset protocol, an action that could only have been performed by someone with access to the house and knowledge of the system. Given that Christopher had a history of visiting the home and was present near the residence on February 13th, law enforcement began to connect the dots with this on-site evidence. The Santa Fe police acted swiftly to secure the arrest warrant. Christopher was taken into custody quickly and without incident. His lawyer, who had previously made public statements asserting his client's innocence, was notified of the arrest just before the news broke. The lawyer, along with some of Christopher's friends, immediately stated that the arrest was based on circumstantial evidence and that Christopher had done nothing wrong. According to Christopher's legal team, the arrest is the result of a misunderstanding and a rushed judgment. They continue to assert that Christopher acted appropriately in protecting his family's privacy during such a difficult time. The decision to file a lawsuit to prevent the release of the autopsy results, they argue, was the action of a son trying to protect the dignity of his parents, not to conceal a crime. His lawyers also point out that Christopher has no history of violent behavior or prior criminal activity, arguing that this suggests the charges are unfounded. Public reaction to Christopher's arrest has been mixed. Some sympathize with him, arguing that he was simply overwhelmed by grief and didn't know how to cope with the loss of his father and stepmother. Others, especially those who have closely followed the case, are less forgiving. They point to the evidence surrounding his finances, the suspicious timing of his legal actions, and his lack of cooperation with investigators as signs that something much deeper is at play. As journalists and commentators speculate about the upcoming trial, some wonder if Christopher's lawyers will argue that he was a victim of circumstances, swept up in a series of strange and unfortunate events that led him to make decisions that seemed far worse than they truly were. Others believe the defense will focus on the lack of concrete evidence directly linking Christopher to the deaths of his parents. Clearly, the case is still ongoing, and there's much more to unfold for Christopher. The arrest was just the beginning. He will remain in custody while his legal team prepares his defense. The bail has been set at a substantial amount, and the trial date is scheduled for the end of the month. For now, Christopher's fate remains uncertain, but one thing is clear. The case has entered a new and dangerous phase. The investigation is no longer just about a sudden couple and mysterious deaths. It has now become a public battle between the Hackman family's legacy and the forces of law, the media, and public opinion seeking the truth. After the arrest, the media frenzy surrounding Christopher Hackman intensified. News outlets scrambled for exclusive interviews with friends, former colleagues, and legal experts. The public's desire to understand Christopher's actions, motives, and the events surrounding the death grew as more and more complicated information emerged. If you found this story surprising and captivating, don't forget to give us a like, share the video, and leave your thoughts in the comments so we know what you think. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other exciting videos. Thank you for watching till the end. See you in the next videos.